What if the most powerful woman in the kingdom was caught red-handed, tampering with the final wishes of a queen? Behind closed doors, under vaulted ceilings heavy with history, a discovery was made that would fracture loyalties and ignite the most dangerous confrontation of King Charles's reign. This wasn't gossip. This wasn't rumor. It was a revelation so explosive, it forced the crown to choose between love and legacy. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. The alarm did not begin with shouting or scandal splashed across headlines. It began quietly, almost invisibly, with a senior palace legal aide reviewing archived estate documents tied to Queen Elizabeth's original will. The task was routine, procedural, the kind of administrative responsibility that rarely carries drama. But something felt wrong. A phrase here, a clause there, subtle changes that seemed almost insignificant at first glance. Yet the more the aide compared the archived copy with the secured master version, the clearer it became that the differences were not clerical errors. They were deliberate, carefully inserted wording adjustments that shifted financial authority and ceremonial privileges toward Camilla's extended family, altering the balance of influence the late queen had so meticulously structured. The realization sent a chill through the inner legal circle. No one panicked publicly. No alarms rang. Instead, a confidential internal audit was triggered under layers of secrecy. Documents were cross-referenced. Digital trails were examined. Access logs were quietly reviewed. The objective was simple: confirm whether this was a misunderstanding or something far more dangerous. Because if the Queen's final directives had been altered, even subtly, the implications would shake the monarchy to its core. When the side-by-side documents were finally presented to King Charles, insiders would later describe him as visibly shaken. This was not merely about money or titles. It was about his mother's final voice, her last expression of trust, loyalty, and legacy. The crown is built on continuity, on sacred respect for the sovereign's wishes. To see discrepancies in that sacred text was to glimpse a crack in the foundation itself. For a man who had waited a lifetime to inherit both throne and responsibility, the moment struck with brutal force. Camilla was summoned. The confrontation, though private, carried the weight of history. Denial came swiftly, at first confusion, then indignation. She reportedly framed the matter as a misunderstanding, a bureaucratic adjustment, misinterpreted by overzealous staff. But tension thickened as the king pressed for clarity. The altered clauses were too precise, too strategically advantageous to be dismissed as oversight. The room did not need raised voices to feel volatile. Silence did the damage. Questions hung in the air, like unspoken accusations. Then came the most unsettling detail of all: the Queen's final signature. Experts were asked to examine whether the authorized version had been replicated or whether amendments had been attached after her passing. Even the suggestion of posthumous manipulation was unthinkable. The monarchy does not merely operate on law, it survives on reverence. And reverence, once compromised, is difficult to restore. Within the royal household, quiet factions began to form. Some defended Camilla, arguing that her decades of service and endurance deserved the benefit of doubt. Others insisted that the integrity of the crown demanded immediate consequences, no matter how painful. Loyalty to a consort collided with loyalty to a queen's memory. The palace corridors, once steady in ceremonial rhythm, pulsed with uncertainty. But what no one anticipated was that this alleged alteration would awaken buried tensions stretching back decades. Tensions rooted not in paperwork, but in a rivalry that had never truly disappeared. Long before titles were reassigned and crowns were inherited, there was a quiet competition for influence within the royal walls. And though history tried to smooth the narrative, old fractures never truly healed. When the will controversy surfaced, it wasn't just about legal text, it was about legacy, validation, and the unspoken war between acceptance and resentment that had defined Camilla's entire journey. For years, Camilla's presence inside the monarchy carried the weight of public skepticism. She had endured headlines that refused to fade, whispers that lingered long after official statements attempted to close old chapters. Her path to legitimacy was not paved with applause, but with endurance. Every appearance, Every charitable patronage, every carefully measured speech was part of a long campaign to transform perception. She survived storms that might have broken others. She stood beside Charles when approval ratings dipped and narratives turned cruel. And eventually, she rose formally acknowledged, crowned queen consort, seated beside the sovereign, not as a shadow, but as a partner. Yet, elevation does not erase memory. While she wore the title, the echoes of Princess Diana's legacy never fully quieted. Diana was more than a former princess. She was emotion incarnate in the public imagination. Her memory lingered in the hearts of millions, woven into the monarchy's modern identity. And though the institution moved forward, that emotional imprint remained. Camilla's every step was measured against a standard shaped by grief, nostalgia, and myth. Even within palace corridors, comparisons were inevitable. It was not spoken loudly, but it was understood. Acceptance had been granted, but was it ever complete? Some insiders would later claim that Camilla felt perpetually provisional in Queen Elizabeth's affections. The late monarch, disciplined and deliberate, was known for her restraint. Approval from her was rarely theatrical. It was steady, practical, institutional. But did Camilla interpret that composure as distance? Did she fear that beneath the formality, she was still seen as an outsider who had entered the story midway through its most turbulent chapter? Those questions now carried heavier implications in light of the alleged will alterations. As Charles ascended the throne, consolidating authority that had eluded him for decades, a new anxiety reportedly emerged. Once he stood firmly as king, would the balance shift? Would advisors who had tolerated Camilla's influence begin to quietly sideline her? Power inside a monarchy is rarely about titles alone. It is about access, proximity, the invisible currents of counsel and persuasion. If the Queen's original will reinforced a hierarchy that limited Camilla's long-term influence, then the document was more than legal structure, it was a verdict, a silent declaration of where enduring loyalty resided. That is why the will became symbolic. It represented not just estates or ceremonial roles, but the Queen's final endorsement of the monarchy's future architecture. To alter it, if that is what occurred, would not merely adjust clauses, it would attempt to rewrite emotional allegiance. And when those discrepancies surfaced, they did more than trigger an audit. They reopened wounds Charles believed had finally healed. He had spent years defending his marriage, rebuilding public trust, guiding Camilla toward broader acceptance. To now face accusations that threatened both her integrity and his judgment was a cruel reversal. The palace, once united in cautious stability, began to feel the tremor of history resurfacing. Old doubts resurfaced alongside new suspicions. And at the center of it all stood a king torn between personal devotion and institutional duty, as those old wounds resurfaced. King Charles found himself facing a question that would define his reign: protect his wife, or protect the crown. For decades, Charles had waited for this moment to rule not as a prince in waiting, but as sovereign. Yet barely settled into the throne, he was forced into a crisis that struck at the heart of his marriage. Could he defend Camilla against accusations that threatened the monarchy itself? Or would he sacrifice personal loyalty to preserve the sacred authority passed down from his mother? The weight of that question did not fade after the confrontation. It intensified. Behind closed doors, Charles reportedly demanded a private forensic review of the original will documents, refusing to rely solely on internal assurances. He wanted precision. He wanted certainty. Handwriting specialists were consulted. Digital authentication experts were discreetly brought into confidence. Access logs were scrutinized down to the minute. If the Queen's final directives had been altered, he needed proof beyond doubt, but every new layer of examination deepened the gravity of the situation, rather than easing it. Because even suspicion, palace lawyers warned, could destabilize public trust. The monarchy thrives not on perfection, but on perception of integrity. A whisper of impropriety surrounding the Queen's last will was enough to send tremors through that foundation. Senior legal advisors reportedly cautioned that if this controversy became public before a clear resolution, it could spiral beyond control. Markets react to instability. Political voices question transparency. The institution itself becomes vulnerable. and so the king stood at the center of a tight, enning circle, aware that hesitation could be interpreted as weakness, yet action could fracture his own household. Trusted advisors, some of whom had served him since his days as Prince of Wales, began offering careful counsel. Several quietly recommended distancing Camilla from certain state affairs while the review continued. Not as an admission of guilt, they insisted, but as a protective measure for the crown, temporarily reduce appearances, reassign sensitive responsibilities, create breathing room. It was strategic, measured, and devastatingly personal, because such a move would signal doubt, even if none had been formally declared. Charles struggled under the strain. Those close to him described him as withdrawn and conflicted, pacing between loyalty and obligation. This was not merely a political dilemma. It was the woman who had stood beside him through decades of scrutiny, the woman who had absorbed public hostility while he carried the burden of succession. To now consider sidelining her felt like betrayal, yet to ignore the allegations felt reckless. The tension carved into him quietly, forcing him to confront the reality that kingship demands sacrifices beyond comfort. Reports suggest that Princess Anne pressed for swift and decisive action. Steadfast and unsentimental, she reportedly reminded her brother that the monarchy cannot afford prolonged ambiguity. Delay, she argued, would allow speculation to metastasize. The Queen's legacy must remain untouchable. If clarity required difficult decisions, so be it. Her resolve sharpened the stakes. For the first time since his accession, Charles felt the full weight of ruling alone. He studied historical precedent, searching for guidance. No consort in modern royal history had faced an accusation tied directly to the integrity of a sovereign's final will. There was no blueprint, no inherited strategy. The absence of precedent made the decision even more isolating. Silence might contain the fire temporarily, but it risked looking complicit. A decisive public move could restore confidence, but at what cost to his marriage? Days stretched into restless nights. Advisors waited. The palace held its breath. The decision loomed, unavoidable and stark. Contain the matter quietly and hope it dissipates, or confront it head-on and redefine the boundaries of royal accountability. The longer he waited, the clearer it became that neutrality was impossible. A king cannot hover between choices forever. And then, in a move no one expected, the king acted swiftly, decisively, and without consulting those closest to him. It was a quiet statement, carefully worded, almost understated, but its meaning thundered through every royal corridor. Queen Camilla would be stepping back from key ceremonial and advisory roles, pending internal review. To the public, it sounded procedural. To insiders, it was unmistakable. The king had drawn a line, and for the first time, Camilla stood on the wrong side of it. The announcement arrived without spectacle, released through official channels, with language so measured it almost concealed its own severity. The phrase administrative restructuring became the shield calm, technical, deliberately bland, yet those who understood palace dynamics recognized the gravity immediately. Administrative restructuring does not remove a queen consort from high-profile duties unless something has fractured beneath the surface. The statement did not mention the will. It did not reference controversy. But silence can be louder than accusation, and this silence echoed with consequence. Within days, Camilla's public appearances were abruptly reduced. Events she was scheduled to attend were quietly reassigned. Invitations that once bore her name shifted to other senior royals. The adjustments appeared seamless on paper, but behind the scenes, they signaled displacement. The rhythm of royal engagements changed. Where she once stood beside the king at ceremonial functions, space emerged noticeable, deliberate. Observers who tracked such details began asking questions. Why now? Why so suddenly? Certain patronages, some long associated with Camilla's personal causes, were discreetly transferred to Princess Catherine. The transition was presented as strategic alignment for the future, a strengthening of generational continuity. But insiders understood the symbolism. Influence within the monarchy is often measured by proximity and portfolio. Reassigning those responsibilities was not merely logistical, it was hierarchical. It suggested recalibration, perhaps even containment. Simultaneously, private staff reshuffles unfolded with remarkable speed. Long-time aides were reassigned. Advisory roles were restructured. Access privileges were reportedly tightened. The internal machinery of the palace adjusted itself as if preparing for a prolonged shift, not a temporary pause. The demotion, though couched in bureaucratic language, carried unmistakable weight. It felt historic, unprecedented in modern royal memory. The media response was immediate and relentless. Commentators dissected every line of the announcement, every altered engagement schedule, every photograph that now showed the king standing alone. Speculation surged across headlines. Was this disciplinary, strategic, permanent? Public curiosity morphed into scrutiny. And as analysis intensified, the palace maintained composure. Charles appeared steady, controlled, unwavering in public. Yet noticeably, joint appearances with Camilla ceased. The visual narrative of unity dissolved into careful separation. Behind fortified doors, another layer of precaution reportedly unfolded. Access to archival legal documents was restricted. Sensitive records were secured under heightened review. Palace security, usually discreet and routine, took on an air of quiet vigilance. The implication was unmistakable. Whatever investigation had prompted this shift was far from resolved. The institution was bracing. For Charles, the decision carried personal cost. To demote the woman who had weathered decades of controversy by his side was not merely administrative, it was emotional sacrifice in service of the crown. The message he sent was clear: the monarchy's integrity supersedes all personal alliances. That clarity may have restored some confidence externally, but internally it deepened fractures that had only begun to surface. And as observers absorbed the magnitude of this unprecedented step, one truth became unavoidable. This was not a symbolic gesture designed to calm rumors. It was a decisive action that acknowledged the seriousness of the allegations without naming them outright. The demotion changed the balance of influence overnight, but it also cracked open a door that had long remained sealed. But demotion was only the beginning, because once the door to scrutiny opened, more secrets threatened to spill out. As legal experts combed through the Queen's original directives, whispers began circulating about additional clauses, provisions that had been quietly shielded from public knowledge. What they revealed didn't just challenge Camilla's influence, they redefined the future of the monarchy itself. And suddenly, this wasn't about a single document, it was about control of the crown's long-term destiny. The deeper the review went, the clearer it became that Queen Elizabeth's final instructions were not merely ceremonial formalities. They were strategic, layered, designed to outlast personalities and preserve continuity across generations. One alleged clause, buried within the new age of estate governance, prioritized direct lineage over extended affiliations in unmistakable terms. It reinforced the primacy of blood succession, limiting the long-term redistribution of influence beyond the immediate royal line. In quiet legal phrasing, it drew a boundary firm, deliberate, protective. Another section reportedly detailed specific financial trusts earmarked for the children of William and Catherine, safeguarding resources for the monarchy's next era. These provisions were not public announcements, they were structural assurances. They ensured that the crown's future would be anchored in continuity, not negotiation. To tamper with wording tied to those trusts would not simply adjust numbers on a page, it would alter the trajectory of generational power. Perhaps most striking was a protective stipulation surrounding royal estates. According to those familiar with the review, the Queen's language shielded certain historic properties from external influence or discretionary redirection. The wording was described as airtight, crafted to prevent gradual dilution of control. It reflected a lifetime of experience navigating both political and familial pressures. Elizabeth had ruled long enough to understand that stability requires foresight. These clauses were her final act of stewardship. Legal analysts examining the documents described the Queen's phrasing as intentionally unambiguous. There was no room for creative interpretation. No open-ended authority that could be stretched to accommodate shifting alliances. That clarity is precisely what made the alleged alterations so alarming. If wording had been adjusted around these protected sections, it would not have been accidental. It would have required intent, precision, knowledge of exactly which lines carried the most weight. Claims began to circulate that the attempted changes, if proven, targeted these fortified clauses directly, the very sections designed to preserve direct lineage and restrict transferable privileges. Certain ceremonial rights and financial authorities were reportedly marked as explicitly non-transferable beyond the sovereign's immediate successors. That specificity now carried explosive implications, because if Camilla's name or affiliated interests had been positioned closer to those protections through altered language, the motive would appear strategic rather than administrative. Inside the palace, aides reportedly feared broader constitutional implications. The monarchy's authority is not merely symbolic. It is interwoven with legal frameworks and public trust. If tampering were confirmed, even at a technical level, it could invite parliamentary scrutiny, questions about oversight, calls for reform. The ripple effect would extend far beyond personal scandal. It would challenge the integrity of succession planning itself. Charles, already burdened by the emotional cost of demotion, now faced a deeper realization. This controversy was no longer confined to marriage or reputation. It touched the architecture of the crown's future. Every clause revealed another layer of foresight his mother had embedded into her final directives, and every potential alteration felt like an intrusion into that carefully constructed legacy. As these hidden clauses surfaced, the atmosphere within the royal household shifted from defensive to vigilant. What had begun as a suspicion was evolving into a confrontation with the monarchy's structural foundations. And in that charged silence, as documents were reviewed and loyalties reassessed, it became clear that the unfolding drama would not be resolved by legal language alone. And as these hidden clauses came to light, another royal figure stepped forward, one whose silence had long concealed a formidable resolve. She had watched quietly, for years measured, disciplined, unshakable. But when the integrity of her mother's final wishes came under threat, Princess Anne reportedly made it clear the crown must remain untarnished, no matter the personal cost. Her intervention, subtle yet firm, shifted the balance of power within the palace walls and strengthened the king's resolve to act decisively. Anne was never one for spectacle. She did not command attention with dramatic gestures or public declarations. Her authority came from constancy, from a lifetime of service carried out without complaint. Yet those who understood palace hierarchy knew that when she chose to speak, it was rarely impulsive. It was deliberate, and in the midst of escalating tension over the will, her voice carried unusual weight. Sources suggest that Anne insisted on complete transparency within the internal review. No selective summaries, no softened conclusions. If discrepancies existed, they were to be confronted directly. To her, this was not merely about legal precision. It was about safeguarding her mother's final act of sovereignty. Queen Elizabeth had ruled with meticulous care, and Anne, more than anyone, understood the depth of thought behind every formal directive. To allow ambiguity now would be to dilute that legacy. Her relationship with the late Queen had always been defined by mutual respect and shared discipline. Anne had absorbed her mother's understanding that monarchy survives by endurance and clarity, not emotional compromise. That bond reportedly fueled her determination. She was not driven by personal rivalry or political positioning. She was driven by duty. And in moments of institutional crisis, duty becomes the sharpest instrument. Private meetings between Anne and Charles intensified during this period. They were not confrontational, according to those familiar with the discussions, but they were candid. Anne reportedly reminded her brother that hesitation invites erosion. The longer uncertainty lingers, the more narratives multiply beyond control. If the monarchy's integrity is questioned, the damage does not remain contained, it spreads. Her counsel was steady, almost clinical. The crown must not appear to protect individuals at the expense of principle. There were whispers that some advisors considered managing the issue quietly, minimizing public exposure while adjusting internal structures. Anne reportedly discouraged such thinking. Containment without clarity she argued, risks deeper suspicion. The institution must be seen as correcting itself when necessary. Silence might feel protective in the moment, but it breeds doubt over time. Her stance signaled a refusal to prioritize comfort over credibility. Royal historians have long noted Anne's reputation for placing responsibility above sentiment. Unlike others within the family, she has rarely courted public favor or softened her approach for approval. That reputation now reinforced her position. If she believed the matter required decisive correction, others took notice. Her resolve emboldened senior royals who had remained cautiously neutral. Gradually, support for firm action solidified. Within the household, loyalties began to crystallize. Lines were not drawn publicly, but internally, the atmosphere sharpened. Those aligned with preserving absolute institutional integrity found reassurance in Anne's leadership. Those hoping for reconciliation sensed the narrowing of options. Charles, already weighed down by personal conflict, could no longer treat the controversy as a private marital strain. It had become a test of royal discipline. Anne did not seek the spotlight. She did not issue statements, but her influence was unmistakable. In the silence of strategy sessions and private consultations, she fortified the king's resolve. The demotion had been the first step. Now the expectation was clear. Whatever the outcome of the investigation, the monarchy must emerge stronger, not shielded. But while the senior royals closed ranks, public perception was beginning to fracture, and the monarchy faced a reckoning beyond palace walls. The British public has weathered scandal before, but altering a queen's will, that crossed a sacred line. Social media erupted, commentators dissected every gesture, and royal watchers demanded clarity. The crown's mystique depends on continuity and honor. If either falters, faith collapses. And now, the monarchy wasn't just fighting an internal battle, it was fighting to preserve its moral authority. What began as controlled silence within palace walls spilled rapidly into global headlines. Analysts speculated, broadcasters replayed past interviews, searching for hidden tension. Every reduced appearance, every subtle shift in engagement schedules became evidence for competing narratives. The phrase, administrative restructuring, was dissected relentlessly, interpreted not as procedure, but as punishment. News outlets framed the demotion as historic. Some described it as necessary accountability. Others saw it as unprecedented instability. The monarchy, once shielded by ritual and decorum, now found itself exposed to real-time judgment. Public opinion surveys reflected rising concern. Trust in the institution, while not shattered, appeared unsettled. Citizens who had admired Queen Elizabeth's steadfast leadership felt protective of her legacy. The mere possibility that her final wishes could have been altered ignited emotional reactions far beyond legal technicalities. For many, the will symbolized continuity, an unbroken thread linking past to future. If that thread had been tampered with, even in wording, it felt like betrayal. Supporters of Camilla countered fiercely. They argued she had endured decades of scrutiny and political maneuvering. To them, the controversy appeared orchestrated an attempt by traditionalists to curtail her influence now that Charles sat firmly on the throne. They framed her demotion as disproportionate, possibly even strategic scapegoating. Sympathy gathered in certain circles, creating a polarized atmosphere where loyalty and suspicion clashed openly. Critics, however, demanded a formal inquiry. They insisted that transparency was the only path to restoring confidence. Accountability, they argued, strengthens institutions rather than weakens them. Calls for independent review panels and public clarification grew louder. The monarchy's reluctance to disclose details fed speculation rather than calming it. In an age defined by instant information, restraint was interpreted by some as concealment. Younger generations began questioning relevance altogether. If the crown could be shaken by internal document disputes, what did that say about its resilience? For a demographic already skeptical of inherited privilege, this controversy felt like confirmation that the monarchy operated behind opaque barriers. The reputational stakes expanded beyond the immediate scandal. This was about perception of fairness, modernization, and moral consistency. Charles felt the pressure intensify. Advisors reportedly urged him to address the nation directly, to offer reassurance, to frame the narrative before it drifted further beyond palace control. Yet any public statement risked inflaming rather than calming the situation. Too little detail would appear evasive. Too much detail could entrench division. The king found himself navigating a communication minefield where every word would carry consequence. Behind the scenes, the palace began crafting a long-term reputational recovery strategy. It loved recalibrating public engagements, reinforcing messages of stability, and highlighting generational continuity through William and Catherine's increasing visibility. The objective was subtle but clear: restore confidence without igniting further controversy. Stability had to be demonstrated, not declared. Yet, despite calculated planning and measured responses, the pressure did not ease. Commentary intensified. The moral authority of the crown remained under scrutiny. The longer ambiguity lingered, the heavier the silence became. And within that charged atmosphere, one question persisted with growing urgency: how would Camilla respond to the storm that now defined her role? And in the midst of mounting pressure, Camilla herself finally broke her silence. After weeks of silence, Camilla reportedly made a private appeal, one that insiders describe as both defiant and deeply emotional. She denied malicious intent, framing the edits as administrative clarifications misunderstood by palace staff. But timing is everything in royal politics, and the damage was already done. The question was no longer whether she altered the will, but whether her explanation could save her standing. The appeal did not come through televised address or carefully staged statement. It came directly to Charles. According to those familiar with the exchange, Camilla insisted that any wording adjustments were clerical in nature, routine refinements meant to clarify procedural ambiguities, not to redirect legacy or influence. She reportedly argued that palace bureaucracy can be labyrinthine, and minor textual edits often pass through multiple hands. In her telling, the controversy had grown far beyond its origin, transformed by suspicion rather than intent. Yet the distinction between clarification and tampering had already blurred in the public imagination. Once doubt attaches itself to something sacred, like a sovereign's final will, it does not retreat easily. Camilla's defense hinged on credibility. She needed Charles to believe not only in her innocence, but in her judgment. Insiders suggest the conversation was charged with vulnerability. This was not a queen consort asserting authority, it was a wife appealing to trust. She reportedly asked for restoration, at least partial, a pathway back to the engagements and patronages she had lost, a public sign that the king's confidence in her remained intact. But such restoration carried risk. Legal advisors cautioned that full reinstatement during unresolved scrutiny could project weakness. It might suggest that the demotion had been symbolic rather than principled. The monarchy could not afford to appear reactive or inconsistent. Reputation, once steadied, must not wobble again. Within palace ranks, divisions sharpened. Some staff members quietly defended Camilla's explanation, arguing that procedural edits could indeed be misinterpreted when viewed without context. Others remained skeptical, pointing to the precision of the clauses in question. The internal debate intensified, not through shouting, but through quiet positioning. Credibility became currency. Trust became fragile. Rumors began circulating that even if cleared of intentional wrongdoing, Camilla's role might never fully return to its previous scope. Permanent limitations were whispered about: reduced advisory influence, narrower ceremonial presence, a recalibrated public identity. The possibility alone signaled transformation. For years, she had fought for legitimacy, climbing steadily toward acceptance. Now, that climb seemed uncertain. Charles, meanwhile, remained publicly silent. His composure was deliberate. Each appearance without commentary underscored that decisions were being weighed with care. Silence, in this context, was strategy. He understood that speaking too soon could lock him into a position before the review concluded. Yet that same silence deepened speculation. Every day without resolution added weight to the narrative that something irreversible was unfolding. The monarchy braced itself. Advisors drafted contingencies, Communications teams mapped potential outcomes. If Camilla were restored fully, messaging would need to emphasize unity and closure. If her role remained restricted, the narrative would pivot toward modernization and institutional discipline. Either path carried consequence. There was no scenario in which the pre-controversy equilibrium simply reappeared. For Camilla, the emotional stakes were profound. She had endured decades of resistance to stand beside Charles as queen consort. To see that standing questioned at the height of her influence was a sharp reversal of fortune. Success and suffering intertwined once more, reminding the public that royal titles do not shield against vulnerability. And as the palace weighed explanation against perception, loyalty against optics, one reality crystallized beneath the tension. Regardless of verdict, regardless of forgiveness, power had shifted, influence had been recalculated, relationships had been tested under relentless scrutiny. Because whether forgiven or not, one truth had become undeniable: the balance of royal power had changed forever. In every reign, there is a moment that defines the monarch, not by triumph, but by trial. For King Charles, the will controversy became that crucible. His decision to demote Camilla sent a message: the crown stands above personal ties, yet the emotional cost lingers, reshaping alliances and rewriting the monarchy's internal code of loyalty. History will not remember this chapter for its technical arguments or procedural language. It will remember the choice. Faced with the most personal crisis of his reign, Charles chose institutional integrity over marital unity. That choice did not come wrapped in celebration. It came heavy, restrained, deliberate. By allowing the demotion to stand and refusing to reverse course under pressure, he signaled that even the queen consort could not stand above scrutiny. The crown, he implied through action rather than proclamation, is not a shield for personal allegiance. Camilla's reduced role gradually settled into a semi-permanent reality. The language of pending review faded from headlines, replaced by a new normal in which her presence remained visible but limited. The grand ceremonial influence she once exercised did not fully return. The adjustment was subtle yet unmistakable, a recalibration rather than exile. In that restraint lay both consequence and containment. She remained queen consort, but the boundaries of her authority were redrawn. At the same time, another shift unfolded with quiet precision. Princess Catherine's influence expanded, not through declaration, but through continuity. Engagements multiplied, patronages strengthened. Her presence at key state functions projected stability and generational confidence. It was not framed as replacement, but the symbolism was clear. The monarchy was looking forward. Continuity now flowed more visibly through William and Catherine, reinforcing a future-focused narrative that soothed public unease. William's role, too, became more central. Observers noted his increased visibility in strategic initiatives and constitutional conversations. Without public commentary, he embodied transition. The controversy had sharpened awareness that succession is not abstract. It is imminent, evolving. In protecting the Queen's legacy, Charles inadvertently highlighted the inevitability of the next chapter. The Prince of Wales stood not as a distant heir, but as a stabilizing force already stepping into expanded responsibility. Above all, Queen Elizabeth's legacy emerged fiercely protected. Whatever suspicions had ignited the crisis, the outcome reaffirmed the sanctity of her final wishes. Her foresight, embedded in the carefully structured clauses, survived intact. The monarchy, though shaken, did not fracture. It adapted. It tightened its internal discipline. It recalibrated its hierarchy. Public trust, while tested, began to stabilize slowly. Transparency through action rather than dramatic confession proved effective over time. The demotion was not reversed impulsively. The investigation was not dismissed theatrically. Instead, the crown absorbed the turbulence and projected steadiness. For many observers, that steadiness restored confidence. Not perfection, but resilience. The monarchy that emerged from this ordeal was not identical to the one that entered it. Power lines had shifted, roles had narrowed and expanded, emotional bonds had been strained under the glare of accountability. Yet the institution endured. Altered, yes. Humbled, perhaps. but intact. Charles's reign, once defined by anticipation, was now defined by a decisive test of principle. And, as the crown steadies itself under a new equilibrium, one lingering question remains: what other secrets lie sealed within the royal archives, waiting for the next storm to break? Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.